Howdy folks. In this video, I'm going to show you how to detect overlapping contracts using Power Query with the List.Dates function and a lot of other fun stuff as well. So if you've got a bunch of contracts and it's pretty important that those contracts don't overlap with a particular client, I'm going to show you how you could build a little query, a little process that'll detect those for you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So I'm going to go ahead and open up my query editor and we're going to look at the problem. Right? My guess is if you're watching this video, you probably have a sense of what the problem is. But if not, oh, hey, look, I'm already done. That's cool. So here's what we're going to end up with because I forgot to delete it until end right before I hit the record button. That's okay. I could do it right now, right? So forget you saw all that. And instead, imagine this scenario right here. So what we have, we got a bunch of contracts, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 contracts. I've added some spaces in here just to make it a little bit easier to see, right? And so contracts belong to a particular client. Normally you'd have like a client number, but I'm just going to use names to make it nice and easy, right? So Linnell here, Linnell's got 2 contracts. We've got 2 contracts out with Linnell. And the idea is these contracts have a start and an end date. And what we want is the day after a contract ends, the next contract should start, right? Gaps aren't too big of a deal, right? If let's say the contract ends, then a week later another one starts, well, that's not ideal, but that's okay. But what we really want to make sure is that we never ever have 2 contracts active at the same time. So Linnell's doing just fine, right? This contract ends on the 4th, and then her next contract, that starts the very next day on the 5th, and it goes to the 8th. These contracts are kind of short, but again, I'm keeping the data kind of small just to make the example nice and easy, right? Pam, this is an example here with our Pam client where we've got some problems, right? So Pam's first contract runs from the 1st through the 7th. So rather than running 4 days like we did up here, we run 7 days, right? Now that in and of itself wouldn't be a problem. Did I say in and of itself or in and of itself? Oh, I can never get those right. This normally wouldn't be a problem, except that the next contract starts 2 days before this, right? So this one ends on the 7th, and this one, her next contract, begins on the 5th. So there's the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th, 3 days where 2 contracts are active at the same time. And this is going to cause us a lot of headaches. So this is something we want to flag and catch really quickly so we don't have to deal with it. Another scenario that pops up a whole lot is here with Roberto. It's not quite as pronounced as this, but it's pretty common. Roberto's also got 2 contracts. The first one goes from the 1st through the 4th. The second one goes from the 4th through the 8th. Did you catch that? The problem right there, right? So this one ends on the 4th. This one starts on the 4th. This is a pretty common problem because they think, oh, what's the problem? You know, they start and end on the same day. Well, no, that means if you're looking at the 4th, both this contract and this contract are active, right? Pretty common problem, this one. People just tend to enter it without thinking about it. But really, the next contract should always start the day after the previous contract begins. So let's build ourselves a little process for actually flagging these problems, right? And this will obviously work if you've got a small number of records. It'll work with a fairly larger data set as well. Okay, so first I added these spacers in there just so you could see the different clients a little bit easier. Your data probably doesn't have these blank lines like this, but if it does, you know, here's how you get rid of them. You head up here to Home, you go to Remove Rows, and you do Remove Blank Rows. Nothing too complicated there. Okay, so now what we want to do is we're going to use a list of dates to go find our conflicts. So a list is a structured value here in the Power Query language that holds a bunch of values in it. So what we want is for each one of these contracts, we want to have a list that has all the days in the contract. So for this contract right here, it should have the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th. For this one right here, it should have the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. So let's go ahead and build that. Now to build it, we already have a lot of what we need. We've got the start date. The other thing we need is the number of days in the contract. We don't have the number of days of the contract, but like we kind of do because we have both the start and the end date. So we can get it. So speaking of which, let's go ahead and get it. So I'm going to click on the end date, and I'm going to control click on the start date. Be sure you do it in that order. End date, then start date, because we're going to use this subtraction button in a second, and so you have to do it in the right order. We want to take this number and subtract this from it. That'll tell us the number of days between these guys, right? So speaking of which, I've got those 2 selected. I'm going to pop up here to Add Column. Don't go to Transform. Go to Add Column. Head over here to the little date drop down. And down here, kind of near the bottom, you will find Subtract Days. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. There we go. Cool. So I took this date and I subtracted this date, which should give me the number of days between this and this. And it gets us close. It gets us close, right? The problem is, when we do this kind of date subtraction, it assumes both of these days we're talking about the very beginning of the day. So what we just asked Power Query to do is tell me the number of days between the beginning of the day on the 1st and the beginning of the day on the 4th, which is why we see 3 right there. But really, the contract doesn't expire at the very beginning of the 4th. It expires at the end of the 4th. So we should really just take this number and add 1 to it. Now, if I wanted to be a cool kid, right, I could actually pop up here to the formula window and just make some changes right up here. That'd be actually not that hard to do. But I kind of want to try and do everything here with the user interface as much as I can anyways. So let's go ahead and do that. So I want to add a number to this column. Well, gosh, that's easy. I'm going to pop up here. Well, first I'm going to make sure that the column is selected. So if I accidentally selected something else, make sure you got this column selected, right? It's supposed to have the number of days in the contract. Head over to Transform. We're going to go to Standard, which looks like a calculator. They probably just should have called this calculator. People would know what it was. But good choice on the icon. This is where we do things like add, multiply, subtract, divide. Speaking of which, we're going to add, and we're just going to add 1. So here in this dialog box where it says, what do you want to add to each one of these numbers, we're just going to type in 1 and hit OK, right? And also, this name of this column, subtraction, that's not very descriptive. I mean, it is what we did, but it's not very helpful. So I'm going to double click on that, and I'm actually going to rename this to days in contract. And I'm going to look really cool by not putting spaces in between the words. If you want to put spaces in between the words, you can. I think that looks cool. Or it's easier. Just force a habit, I guess. Okay. So, hey, for each one of these contracts, we've got the start date, the end date, which we actually don't even need, and we've got the days in contract. The start date and the days in contract are what we actually need to build our list of dates. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to pop up here, go to Add Column, and I'm going to choose Custom Column. Custom Column. So I'm going to add a column based on a custom M formula, a custom M expression. M is the language of Power Query. So this is the number of days in the contract. I'm going to name this column Dates in Contract because it's going to be a list of all the dates in the contract, right? And so to generate that list of dates, I'm going to use a function called List.Dates. List.Dates. List.Dates generates a list of dates, which is why it's got a pretty good name, right? So argument number 1 is, what is the starting date? Well, we've already got that as a column. So I'm going to double click on start date. Argument number 2 is, how many days are in this list? Or I should say, well, how many dates are in the list? Well, we've got that as well. That's days in contract. So I'm going to double click on that. Argument 3, frankly, I don't think you should actually have to fill out argument 3. I think this should be automatic. But for whatever reason, it wants to know the number. It wants you to specify the number of days in between each day in the list. I have never ever told it to do anything besides 1, which is to say, each day in the list should be 1 more than the day before it. If I wanted to, I could do 7, and each day would be 1 week after the day before it. But I've never ever used that, and I'm not going to use it today. So to tell it I want 1 day between each day in the list, I'm going to type in duration.from, then in open parentheses, number 1. I'm going to close parentheses once to close out the duration.from function, add a little spacey there for my eyes, and then add another closing parentheses to close out the List.Dates function. So go generate a list of dates. It should start that day. It should have that many days in it. And between each date in the list, there should be 1 day of difference. So I'll go up by 1 day each time. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I get this thing right here, right? And if you've ever gone to Home and used the Merge Queries option, the join option, you will have gotten something similar, but it will say table, 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 table. And if you're like most folks, you will have completely ignored it and either deleted the column and given up entirely, or muddled through by clicking on the little rabbit ears and exploding that column out. I don't want to do either of those things. What I want to do is I want to actually peek inside this column. I should say, when you use merge queries, it says table, table, table. Here it says list, list, list. So a list is a structured value. It's a value that holds other values in it. Just like a table technically is a value that holds other values in it. So inside each and every one of these cells, if you want to think of them as cells, is a thing that holds a bunch of values, these lists right here. And I could peek inside of it by not clicking on the list, but by clicking kind of right off to the side right there. So I'm going to click right there, left click. And when I do, I will see that this list, this structured value, has the following dates in it. The 1st of January, the 2nd of January, the 3rd, and the 4th, which, by the way, is all the dates between the 1st and the 4th. That's exactly what I want. If I come down here and click right in the middle of this cell, right, I will see I will have a list, a structured value that has a bunch of dates in it, and those dates are all the dates from the 5th through the 8th. The 5th through the 8th. That's all the days in that contract. If I preview this list right here, right, I will see that this list has all the days from the 1st through the 7th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And I can already start to see the problem, right? Because when I go peek in the next list, what I will see is the list that I'm in right now has both the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. And when I peek in the next list, it also has the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. That's because this contract right here and this contract right here both have those days within its boundaries, right? So we can already start to see where the problem's going to pop up. And I don't mean the problem in terms of us solving it. I mean like what we're trying to flag, right? So this list and this list have the same days in them. That's going to be a trigger for us that we have a problem. Okay. Lastly, if I come down here and I peek inside this list, it goes from the 1st through the 4th. And then if I peek inside the very last list, don't click on the list itself, click right off to the side, you will see that it runs from the 4th through the 8th. So both of these have the 4th of January in both this one, the second contract for Roberto, and this one, the first contract for Roberto. Okay, good. So now that we've got this list, we actually don't need these middle 3 columns anymore. So I'm going to click on Start. I'm going to shift click on Days in Contract. I'm going to right click and I'm going to do Remove Columns. I actually don't need them anymore, right? I want to just sort of focus on the things that are absolutely essential here. So now we've got this column that has a bunch of lists in it. What I want to do is I actually want to explode those out. And I'm going to get, and by doing so, I'm going to change the way that this table is structured. Right now, this table is 1 row per contract. In a second, it's going to be 1 row per day per contract. So if I peek inside this list, right, what was Linnell's first contract being 1 row will now be 4 rows. 1 for the first, 1 for the second, 1 for the third, and 1 for the fourth. Right? And that'll happen for all of these lists, right? So I'm going to go ahead and hit the bunny ears right here. And I'm going to do expand to new rows. And notice when it says Linnell's first, I'm going to click on it. Linnell's first now appears 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Once for each day in the contract. We've gone from a table that has 1 row per contract to a table that has 1 row per contract per day, okay? So now, good. We're doing really good here. So what I'm going to do next, you actually don't need this to process the query, sort of to do the work, but to help us understand, I'm going to rearrange these things and do some sorting. So I'm going to take dates and contract, and I'm just going to left drag and just drag it in between these two guys right there, right? And now, again, you don't have to do this part, but just so we can understand what's happening a little bit better, I'm going to sort by client, sort ascending. I'm going to sort by date, sort ascending, and I'm also going to sort by contract, just because why not, right? And so what you will see is, for Linnell, that client, we've got the scenario that we like, right, where there's no problems, where she starts her first day of being on contract is on the 1st, and then we go the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. When we go from the 4th through the 5th, we jump from the first contract to the second contract, but there are no days where 2 contracts are active. By contrast, if we head down here to Pam, right, the first contract starts in the 1st, we go 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, but then on the 5th, notice the next row is also the 5th, because Pam has a contract, 2 contracts open on the 5th. One is her first contract, contract 03, and one is her second contract, contract 04, right? So if two contracts are active, that day will appear twice in this list, right? If you'll remember, hers went out like a couple days. So on the 6th, there's also the same 2 contracts are active. The 6th appears there and there, once for her first contract, once for her second. And right here on the 7th, that appears twice. The 7th appears twice for Pam because she's got both the first and the second contract active on that particular day, okay? When we get to the 8th, well, that first contract stops, and we've only got 1 row for her on the 8th, so that's okay. It's just on the 7th, the 6th, and the 5th that we have a problem. Likewise, if you look at Roberto, right, he's doing really good up until the 4th, right? So for the 1st, the 2nd, and 3rd, there's only 1 row for Roberto for each one of those dates because he's only got 1 contract active. But when we get to the 4th, there's 2 different rows for the 4th of January. 1 for the first contract, 1 for the second contract. Okay, so what we want to do now, is for each one of our clients, right, for each day, we want to know how many contracts are active. That'll tell us the days where there are more than 1 contract active at a time, which is what we want to avoid, right? So that's pretty easy, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Client, and I'm going to Control-click on Dates in Contract. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to head down to Group By. Group By. I love Group By. I use it all the time. So what Group By is going to do is it's going to get me all the combinations of client and dates in contract, right? So we're already pretty close, but there's several duplicates here for when, a contract is active on multiple dates. And when we get all the combinations of client and dates in contract, we're furthermore going to ask Power BI to tell us, hey, tell us how many rows in this table that we're looking at right now exist for that particular client for that particular day, which is another way of saying how many active contracts do we have for that client for that day. Active contracts, right? So if you'll notice here for the 5th for Pam, right, there's 2 rows for the 5th for Pam. So in a second, it's going to say Pam and 5th, and next to it, it'll say 2 to represent both of these contracts being active on that day. I go ahead and click OK. And sure enough, for Pam, if we head down to the 5th, we'll see that there are 2 active contracts on that day, and also 2 active on the 6th, and also 2 active on the 7th, right? Now, if it just says 1, well, that's a well-behaved set of contracts, right? That means there's not 2 active on that day. So we can kind of ignore those. So if I want to ignore those or filter them out, I could click on this little drop-down and say, I'm not going to click on the 1, because what I want to get is if there's 2 contracts, I want to capture that. If there's 3 contracts, I want to capture that. If there's 4, if there's 5, if there's 1,000, I want to capture everything bigger than 1 contract, right? So if we say, hey, only keep the rows where we've got more than 1 contract active for that client for that day. Boom. And now we will see all of our clients and all the days where we have conflicts and the number of active contracts on that day. Now, for most folks, this is actually probably just fine, getting this list right here. But I want to go just a step further. I want to actually see what the contracts are, and I kind of want to see not 1 per day, but just 1 per conflict, which might be a little bit nicer. So to do that, I'm going to have to rewind a little bit. I'm going to remove this filtered step, right? And remind us what we did a second, how we got to this right here, right? So this grouped rows, what is this doing? Before we had this step, we had 1 row per contract per day, right? So for every contract, we had all the days of that contract. And this right here summarized it and said, all right, go get all the clients, go get all the days, and tell us how many rows were active in the previous table, which is another way of saying how many contracts were active. But all we have here is a number. It doesn't tell us what the contracts are. So to improve this a little bit, I'm going to click on this little gear icon. Click on that little gear icon right there, and I'm going to click on Add Aggregation. And the name of this aggregation, the aggregation column that I'm adding, I'm going to call it Filtered Records. Filtered Records. And my operation is not going to be a count rows. It's not going to be a sum, an average, a min, a median, anything like that, anything you're used to. We're going to use this one down here that you probably have, maybe you looked at it or you've ignored it, but you've almost certainly never used it. We're going to use it right now. I'm going to click on all those. Unless you're me or somebody who follows a lot of my videos, you probably use this all the time. Everybody else, you probably not used it before. So what is this thing going to do, right? All rows. I mean, I know what sum does. I know what average does, right? What does all rows do? Well, when I click OK, we get a column again of structured values. Before we were looking at lists, now we're looking at tables. So each one of these cells has a teeny tiny table inside of it that has records from the previous table, right? So again, this step is summarizing this step right here, right? And it's saying go get all the combinations of client and dates and contract, right? And if we think about Pam on the 5th, right? Well, there are 2 rows, right? 1 for the first contract and 1 for the second contract. Before, it just took these 2 and just sort of compressed them down and said, hey, I'm just going to show the number 2 to show that we had 2 contracts active on that day. But that little teeny table is going to have actually both this row and this row. So it's going to have all the rows associated with Pam and the 5th, right? So if I come back to this last step, if I click like right here, right, on the very first one, right in the middle of the cell. Don't click on the table. I hardly ever click on that. Click right off here in the middle, the preview. These are the rows associated with Linnell for the 1st of January in the previous table, right? These are the rows associated with Linnell for the 2nd of January in that previous table. And if we come down here to Pam on the 5th and click right there in the middle, we will see both rows associated with the previous table. These are both rows of the previous table representing the days where these contracts were active. So we could see both the first contract and the second contract. If I counted these rows, I would get the 2 right there. But I don't want to count them. I want to actually take the text right here and combine it. Cool, let's do that. Okay, so we've got these teeny tiny tables here in these cells. What I want to do is I want to rip out this column into a list so that I could sort of combine its values. It's actually not too tricky. You just have to remember the name of the thing, right? So I'm going to make sure I click in the middle of this cell so I've got the preview so I can see what the name of that column is in this teeny tiny table. I click on Add Column. I go to Custom Column, and I'm going to name this custom column. I'm going to name it Contracts, plural. Contracts, plural, right? And so how do I get, what's the definition for this new column? Well, what I want to do, I'm here in my formula bar, I'm going to double click on Filtered Records, right? And so for each one of these filter records, for each one of these teeny tiny tables, I want to go get the contract column and extract it into a list. So I come here to the end of my reference to that column, and I say for each one of the values in there, reach inside of it and get the contracts column and pull it out as a list, right? That's what that means right there. Okay, so go to each filter record, go to each one of these tables and pull out the contracts column, that right there. So I click on OK. And I typed it in wrong. What did I type wrong? Did I type, oh, I bet it was, I know what I did. Here, hold on, let me preview so you can see what I did wrong. I called it contracts in my formula. It's actually contract singular. So let me go fix that. Sorry about that. So I'm going to change this from contracts to contract. And when I hit OK, hopefully it behaves a little better this time. Ah, much, much better. Okay. So now, if I preview it by sort of peeking inside the list here for the first cell, we could see for that day, for that client, that's the contract that's active. And I could peek inside this cell. For that day, for that client, that's the contract that's active. When I come down here to the 5th for Pam, and I peek inside that list, I can see both contracts that are active as a list, right? There's that one right there, and there's that one right there. But Brian, we're still not done yet. I don't care that it's a list. I want to see this, comma, then this, and not any of this funny yellow stuff. I just want the actual text right there. Okay, well, we could do that too. Speaking of which, I want to combine the elements of each one of these lists with a little separator between them. So I'm going to come up here to the bunny ears and say take each item of the list, extract values, take each item in the list and combine them. If there's only one, well, then you don't have to do anything. If there's two or more, I want you to put a comma and a space between them, a delimiter. So I'm going to click here for my delimiters. I'm going to choose custom because I want both a comma and a space. So I do comma, space. I click OK. And boom, now for each and every client, for each and every day, I have the contracts listed that are active on that day. Hey, pretty darn cool. Okay, so we're getting awfully close to being done. Before I do anything else, I'm going to filter out any of these days where there's only one contract active, because who cares? Who cares? I'm going to come down here and do greater than, because anything bigger than 1 I want to see. So is greater than 1. If there's 2 active, I want to see it. If there's 3 active, I definitely want to see that. There we go. Okay. So now that I've got this, I actually don't really need these columns anymore. So I'm going to click on this one and this one. I'm going to right-click and click Remove Columns just to get rid of those. And just for our sake, I'm going to just sort of rearrange these things a little bit, make it a little easier to look at. I'm going to take this last one and drag it here in the middle. So we've got the clients, we've got the contracts that are active on that particular day. And that's nice, but I probably don't need 4 records. What I really need is just 2 records. One that says, hey, by the way, there's a conflict between contract 3 and 4, and it goes from the 5th through the 7th. And then a second row that says, hey, there's a conflict between contract 5 and 6, and it goes from the 4th, to the 4th. It's only one day. Okay, so to do that, we're going to use that same group by trick again. I'm going to click on Client, Control-click on Contracts, right-click, and do Group By. Group By. Group by, group by, group by. Okay, so now what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say, hey, go get every combination of client and contracts. So since these are sort of the same pair over and over again, it's going to collapse these first 3 rows into a single row, right? And what we want to do is we want to find out when the start of the conflict is and the end of the conflict, which is going to be the min and the max of this column. So the min will give us 5, and the max will give us 7 if we're looking at that sort of first combination of contract and client right there, right? So speaking of which, right, we're here in group by, we're grouping by client and contracts. We're going to have 2 aggregation columns. The first one is conflict start, and that's going to go operation from the min of dates in contract. And we also want conflict end, which is going to be the max of the dates in contract. Okay, so for Pam, for the conflict between 03 and 04. The middle give us the 5th and the 7th. So when we click OK, we should just see 2 rows. We should just see 2 rows, right? We've got our list of clients, and we've got the contracts for that client, the client number, contract number 3 and number 4. These 2 contracts are in conflict with each other, and that conflict starts on the 5th, and it goes through the 7th. And for Roberto, well, his contracts in conflict are contracts 5 and 6, and that conflict starts in the 4th and ends in the 4th. It's only a one-day conflict, okay? So that is how you could use List.Dates and a whole bunch of group bys to actually pretty quickly build one of these data quality queries to check on overlapping contracts, which should be pretty helpful for you. So speaking of which, I do really hope that was helpful to you, and I will see you next video.